Alright, lady. Wow. Okay, baby, let's do this. Take two. Sup, ladies? Check me up on Grindr. Yeah, so I'm gonna warn you right now. This video is going to contain a lot of spoilers. Over here. Is that enough time, editing Joe? So, my intention in this video isn't to convince someone that Japan Sinks 2020 is an intensely brilliant story with excellent storytelling. If you think it's strange, or goofy, or what have you, I don't care. I personally enjoyed it for the most part, and there were a few moments where I thought the show was a bit jank, but I want to treat my audience like adults, and it's not my job to tell you how I think a story should be written or expressed. I'm not a storytelling prescriptivist, I just like talking about things that I think are interesting. And Japan Sinks 2020 is really interesting. As someone who's read both the 70s and 2006 novels, watched the films, kinda watched the television series, I've read some of the manga. Science Saru's Japan Sinks 2020 continues his rather important lineage in the massive disaster franchise. And it brings to light quite a few new things to the table that, in many ways, is in line with Komatsu Sakio's original work, trying to walk this tightrope between a faithful homage of the sentiments that the original work seemed to present, but also presents new, vital perspectives on the series. Okay, so what's the thesis? Japan Sinks 2020 hints at some major contemporary anxieties that the country faces, particularly in terms of how the country tackles disasters in an international spotlight, and in focusing on a multi-ethnic family also really stresses what it means to be Japanese, but it's done so through an incredibly contemporaneous cluster of disaster images that not only borrows from previous Japan Sinks, but co-opts a lot of the sentiments that emerge out of 311. Japan Sinks 2020 isn't necessarily reinventing the wheel or revolutionizing how disaster is portrayed, but it does fill in some major gaps in the previous text while also accounting for critical developments in Japanese disaster fiction. Hey there, it's your boy Pause and Select, and I'm melting under these LED lights. Holy crap, they're hot. I'm going to be talking about Japan Sinks 2020, where it stands, what it's doing differently, and why it's an interesting addition to a massive, ongoing series in disaster fiction. So here's the thing. Why the 311 connection? What's Komatsu Sakio got to do with it? How does this all connect to science fiction? Okay, let me bring in somebody who knows way more about this than I do. Hey, Rebecca, thank you for agreeing to this.
Yeah, no, pleasure.
So for our audience, can I get you to just provide a brief bit of info as to who you are, what your research is, and why is this all important?
Yeah, so my name is Rebecca Suter. I am Associate Professor of Japanese Studies at the University of Sydney in Australia, and my specialization is literature and popular culture. I work a bit, I teach and also research quite a bit on, genre fiction, and within that, science fiction and speculative fiction. The main thing, in fact, that I've published on the subject of the Japan Sinks various iterations is this chapter, a little bit elsewhere as well.
Okay, so book chapter is apt, but Rebecca is kind of underselling how interesting her chapter is because she knows just how different 311 felt. So in the beginning, she notes that one of Komatsu's last works wasn't a story, but an essay. In 311 no Mirai, the future of 311, Komatsu wrote about how the Tohoku triple disaster is kind of unique in a sense. Okay, let's pause for a second there. The Tohoku triple disaster refers to the earthquake, tsunami, and reactor meltdowns that occurred on March 2011. Brief numbers, it was the fourth most powerful earthquake in the history of seismology, with 18,500 casualties, 3.5 million refugees, 3 reactor meltdowns, water that was up to 120 feet or 40 meters high, $210 billion in damage, being the costliest natural disaster in recorded human history, The triple disaster is often referred to the ever-ominous title of 311. So with that in mind, let's go back. The disaster essentially had an unprecedented impact on the international image of Japan that, given its sheer scale, and because it was broadcast in real time to a degree never seen before, it seemed that 311 ushered in a different set of challenges, ones that stressed that Japan's future is also wrestling with where the country was globally. In this sense, Komatsu picked up on something critical. 311 was not only a re-evaluation of what internally Japan should do and how it should proceed as a country in the wake of a catastrophe, but also how it should present itself when the eyes of the world are watching it.
Yeah, it was an interesting collection because it was a mix of essays by scholars of science fiction and by authors of science fiction. So it was sort of combining those two perspectives, that of the artist and that of the researcher that studies their work. That same collection, which, like I said, has some essays by researchers and some by authors. So Motokara is a writer of science fiction. And so she has an essay in the collection on how, well, in today's world, so many things are like that, like they affect us personally, but we don't have the necessary knowledge to understand how they work in practice is not feasible for the average person. So she says that's one important role that science fiction can have in society. It is to give us a bit of an understanding of scientific concepts that we can access in a format that is easier to consume.
Yeah, and of course, the question becomes, if science fiction is important, and science fiction writers are important, why Komatsu Sakyo? So why this specific science fiction author? And what about him makes his opinions particularly valuable?
Well, Komatsu Sakyo is really one of the main, most significant authors of Japanese science fiction of the post-war period. So he's really been quite significant, and particularly, I guess, like he really writes that kind of big, broad scope science fiction novels. He is the author of the first novel that was called Nihon Chinbotsu Japan Sinks, that I guess Japan Sinks 2020 is inspired by or referencing. So that's a work from 1973, and yeah, that work is very much about this Japan's role within a global context, as well as, I suppose, the way in which natural disaster of great proportions is not just a national phenomenon. He was able to write an essay commenting on the role of his own work and also other Japanese science fiction authors' work in sort of imagining the kind of disasters that then happened for real in Japan in March of 2011. But I mean, the main criticism, I guess, is sort of government response and how it sort of let down the population in a way. So how, I guess, a natural disaster is a natural disaster. It's not man-made per se, but the way in which the institutional response to the disaster, he comments on how that was, in some ways, criticizable, I guess.
What matters here, right, is that science fiction in this sense inhabits a vital middle ground where discussions about technology, politics, history, and society interlock. But it's also done in a way that makes it digestible and interesting. Thank you, Rebecca. I appreciate it.
Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, so let's set up with where we are right now. If the science fiction writer is a voice of a social, political, and personal condition, and Komatsu is a particularly noteworthy science fiction writer, given that his last work was about 311, but he's also really popular, what then is going on in Japan Sinks 2020? How is Science Saru envisioning one of his biggest works? At the heart of Japan Sinks 2020, it seems to me to be a negotiation between a global and a local image. The text is a critique of this sort of mentality that in the wake of these crises, we're supposedly overcoming these odds, and while even international eyes are watching, we still shouldn't be okay with just depicting overcoming a disaster, but earnestly engaging with exactly how brutal these catastrophes can be. Alright, so how does it do this? 1. Japan Sinks 2020 intensely focuses on seriously evaluating what a global image means. Now let's be clear here. The Netflix show isn't fundamentally unique when it comes to an international image. This has actually been around from the beginning. While international representation in the films are relatively scant, Higuchi's for instance focusing almost entirely on Japan, the novels are quite broad. The 1973 novels regularly feature international actors like Australia and Brazil. In the 2006 novels, which are set 25 years after the islands have already sunk, the story focuses heavily on how the Japanese acclimate to new environments, particularly Papua New Guinea and Kazakhstan. But Japan Sinks 2020 interlocks Japan's national image with its global image and levies a pretty upfront critique of a lot of ethno-nationalist sentiments. And Yuasa's mentioned this before in a few places, noting that when we think about Japan Sinks, the texts often revert to talking points like Japan was good, or we're Japanese, or we're part of the Japanese race, and these have sort of ethno-nationalist directions and bents. But in reality, he's rather more focused on tackling regular everyday folks, people who are born and raised in Japan, but don't really have a stake in, Japaneseness per se. And there's a lot of really small stuff, right? You've got Kite's footage, for instance, which is treated with obvious skepticism because it's an absurd idea that all of Okinawa sinks. But the info feed coming from YouTube already links them into a global mediascape. And they don't reason it as the absurdity of the event, but rather as anti-Japanese propaganda, an attack on the islands themselves.
騙されないようにね。
日本を潰した奴らがデマを拡散してるのね。
It's also unsurprising that the islands shown are Okinawa, which exists in a middle zone between American, Chinese, and Japanese interests, but is fundamentally registered as an attack against the Japanese identity, because they're the ones who own it. But there's also some really large stuff. Aside from the Muto family's obvious international roots, but with the mom being Filipino and the son's liberal use of English phrases,
it's nothing.
The show treats the critiques of that international image as largely the rhetoric of crazed and toothless conservatism. Look at how some of the conservative characters treat Go. The grandfather, for instance, is a curmudgeon who tells him that he should be speaking Japanese.
ここは日本で。お前は日本人だ。
But at the same time, he's also presented as not only incredibly stubborn, but hardly cogent. I mean, one of the major proponents of a pure Japanese identity comes from a man suffering from morphine withdrawal, with probably some kind of PTSD, but it's not even just that. Consider the Uyoku ship in episode 7. The ferry master really only stops Go when he speaks in English.
See you around.
待て。
The mother, who's completely foreign, she's already on the raft. The ethno-nationalist sentiment is functionally empty. The guy doesn't know she's foreign until she mentions it, because she already got on the raft. Japaneseness has no innateness. It's an empty signifier that simply upholds a vague idea of a Japanese identity, but the show knows that whatever that identity is, it's completely incongruent. And what happens to the ship? Well, it blows up. Not only is it suggesting that this idea of an ethno-nationalist Japan is an unacceptable future for Japan, but it's also somewhat rich in irony given that far-right politicians like Shintaro Ishihara have described Japan as a ship without a moral rudder. So in this sense, when the far-right command the ship, when the far-right are finally steering the ship, they end up taking everyone down with them. We can also extend the global image and discussions about what or where Japan should be with regards to Kite. Kite is, on a surface level, a pretty straightforward reference to the role of the foreigner, the gaijin who enters Japan and simply watches and engages, but he isn't Japanese. And initially, they're a limit case of that sort of gaijin panic. They're a tourist in the most extreme sense. Someone who goes into an area, finds it interesting, and while they affect the lived spaces around them, they don't actually live there.
誰も案内してほしいとか頼んでませんけど、さっさと飛んでいけばいいじゃないですか。さっき行こうとしてましたよね。
気が変わった。
Kite's initial character is an extreme stereotype of an isolationist imagination of an invasive foreigner. Kite's the one who's taking the footage of Okinawa as it's sinking. Kite's the one who marginalizes the family's death march in the West. And Kite's the one who, regardless of their true feelings, seemingly finds legitimate joy and excitement in a real disaster, up to and including framing themselves as the hero of a story.
日本を救う手柄を俺たちいただいちゃおうぜ。
But what happens? At the moment where it seems like Kite's mask is supposed to come off and reveal themselves as the self-aggrandizing person that they're supposed to be.
長い付き合いだったな。気まぐれな付き合いはおしまいだ。おっさんを頼んだぞ。
Kite's willingness to put themselves in danger for the kids, regardless of anything they say, stresses that the relationship between Japan, Japanese culture, and the foreign consumers of that culture isn't as clear-cut. It's especially important considering it's a critical paradox. A country that's dependent on the export of its cultural goods must figure out where it stands when those same foreigners, those same consumers, commodify this national identity. In this sense, both the Muto family and Kite are critiques of the same essentialist concern, ones that have been rather notably tackled with a lot more reticence in previous Japan Sinks texts. The Mutos are not only stressing that a global Japan means not only disconnecting with this idea that the Japanese must be ethnically Japanese, but also resurges questions of Japanese multi-ethnicity, given that Japan is already quite multicultural and multi-ethnic. And for Kite, they temper not only the scare of foreigners, but also reminds us that it was a global audience and mediascape that witnessed, but also helped Japan during 3/11. But there's also something with what the global audience is seeing, because it wasn't actually the whole picture. Two, Japan Sinks 2020, compared to many other Japan Sinks texts before it, is actually a peripheralized rendition of disaster. Okay, so what the hell does that mean? Okay, so we got a core and a periphery. We can think of the core as a central controlling beneficiary for the, the part that manages, and the periphery as one being managed, or more generally, an appendage. Think of it as primary and secondary, but the primary oftentimes has a vested interest in keeping the secondary, secondary. Japan Sinks 2020 is focused on the secondary, the periphery, and it makes a lot of sense given that 3/11 occurred in a periphery zone. Tohoku is actually in the periphery. The regular, everyday people are really loosely put a periphery, but at the same time, because of the disaster and its size, it was impossible to ignore. And this is really important. When we think about big disaster texts coming out of Japan and exactly what sort of disasters they tend to follow, they tend to be dominated, though not exclusively, by urban disaster imaginations. The Nikkei crash, the 9/11 security precarity, the Ohm attack, the Hanshinkwei, they're all focused around the impacts of largely urban environments, and yet they're the ones that end up defining so many of Japan's media works. 3/11 is a bit different. It's a rural disaster, but at the same time, it's the costliest natural disaster in recorded human history. It cannot, in effect, be easily ignored, either by Japan or the world. And in being so, it also focuses on the people in these environments, setting up a sort of representative link between regular, ordinary people and the destruction of rural Japan. In previous Japan Sinks texts, they've largely focused on technocrats, bureaucrats, politicians, military personnel, scientists. And when there are regular people, they tend to have some broader, wider macro political consequences, such as being the leader of a refugee camp that might go on inside a major incident. Ugh. But for most of the show, Japan Sinks 2020 is largely focused on the tribulations of everyday people, not people running the country. Yuasa has mentioned something similar, knowing that he's more comfortable with depicting everyday people in these disasters, and less so the people in power.
それをこうね、国の側からとか、国のトップの人たちの側からこう見て書くのは自分には難しいなというふうに思ったんですけど、それをこう一般の何もそういう情報もないよくわからない普通の人がそういう震災にあったらっていう感じはなんか自分にも書けると思ったんで、そういう形でアプローチできればっていうことで OK しましたね。
In fact, the show is quite clear about this peripheralization. Though they start in Tokyo, the Mutos don't go east deeper into the city, but west into the countryside. And the show depicts the countryside as having its own challenges. Okay, we might think of like the wild boar sequences as a little goofy, right? That it happened quickly in the span of a day, but it's not that crazy. Japan is losing some of its rural towns to wild boars. And the radiation also doesn't help. But one of the things that's important about the boar isn't just that you watch someone trying to catch, kill, and cook a boar, and you laugh at some anime city kids being unable to handle it, and it's got some downtime before it all goes crazy. But the boar is predicated on the acknowledgement that we easily think about the sinking of Japan as a disaster puncturing a moment's peace. But here's the trap. That moment's peace is a privileged urban imagination. For rural Japan, it's already dying. The population is already dwindling. Nature is already reclaiming parts of it. It was already sinking, but the sinking is so slow that it can be difficult to see from the core of Tokyo. So in one sense, you have the cities depicting widespread destruction with visceral bombast, and on the other, you have the towns that are already dying. It didn't take the sinking of Japan for these towns to be like this. It was already like this, and it's no surprise that some stranger moments happen in the rural areas because the frame of reference is from people from the city. The gas, the unexploded ordinances, the radioactive rain, the boars, the landslide. The show purposely fails to distinguish between what was caused by the destruction and what was already there. And the reason why it's doing this is because the show is recalling memories of 3/11 that might feel easily lost to time. Writer and scholar Yuko Nishimura, in discussing how 3/11 was covered both nationally and internationally, noted how there arose internal struggles to come to an understanding of how the national self-concept might deal with reinventing itself in the light of regional inequalities, that new myths about the Japanese as a whole have arisen and were being carried around the world as part of the 3/11 mediascape. Nishimura, as a Tohokuite herself, also recalls how strange the surreal haunting imagery of the landscape weeks after the disaster was. She notes, "The reality that my partner and I encountered as we drove became increasingly unreal. Convoys of the SDF military trucks heading to the coast, and then as we reached the crest of a hill overlooking Rikuzen Takeda, once a beautiful coastal town, we were frozen by a shocking landscape. This cannot be Japan, I thought. It looked like a battlefield. All of the town's buildings had been wiped out, and there was nothing to block our view except a few collapsed concrete buildings, bent or squashed with iron reinforcement bars exposed. I felt I was in a nightmare, a surreal story in which the entire planet had been destroyed by the atom bomb." And remember, as Komatsu mentioned, because this is the first major disaster in Japan to be streamed and broadcast all over the world, everyone saw it. And Japan Sinks 2020 tries to capture some of that shock, and not just even in the twisted bodies beneath the crumbled houses or falling from the skies.
So I realize that this joke doesn't actually work, so I'm just going to explain it. " What we're seeing here is, in effect, a fire whirl. Now, a fire whirl is essentially where hot air is pushed up really rapidly as a result of a large cluster of fires. They tend to form over open areas, which unfortunately is also the areas that people tend to go to when disasters occur, especially in highly dense urban areas like, what we might see in Tokyo, which is where the Muto family are right now. Fire whirls are incredibly dangerous, they're incredibly fast, they're very intense, and they can form, because they form over open areas where people tend to gather during disasters, they can be incredibly deadly, hence why you see people falling from the skies all on fire and all that kind of stuff. One of the most dangerous fire whirls in recorded history, for instance, actually happened during the 1923 Great Kanto earthquake, which effectively killed around 38,000 people within the span of 15 minutes. So, yeah, what we're seeing there actually is pretty accurate in a lot of senses. So, it's not that strange. I thought this joke would land a lot better, but realized, editing this again, I was just like, nah, this is not going to work. Okay, let's get back to the main video.
By focusing on ordinary people, there's a few things that Japan Sings 2020 can talk about that previous texts have been largely reticent or hesitant to approach. Both Tsutsui Noriko and Watanabe Minoru separately describe a situation that occurs during a major disaster. They use the words mieru hokai and mienai hokai, referring to visible and invisible collapses. Tsutsui was talking about in the context of 3/11, whereas Watanabe, being a disaster management crisis reporter, he's got a lot of titles, tends to talk about in the context of the Hanshin quake, which is what he studied on the ground up. What the hell? But the general sentiment remains. The visible collapse refers to the clear destruction we see, the rubble. The invisible collapse is the destruction of social bonds and social controls. This invisible collapse is particularly important in the context of the global image of Japan during 3/11. A lot of the early rhetoric coming out of it focused on this gaman image, an image of calm and disciplined Japanese citizens, everything running kind of properly. But Japan Sings 2020 doesn't really do that. In the show, they aren't calm and disciplined. They actually run the whole gamut. A lot of them are pretty selfish and dastardly. Many are opportunistic and outright vile human beings. And it does so because of the advantages in this particular vantage point. By moving away from a lot of the more general political and technocrat perspectives of previous Japan Sings texts, this one lets us witness this invisible collapse much more clearly. For instance, the show critically shows that sexual violence is a real problem, especially in Japan after the disasters. In the manga 51 Ways to Protect Her, which Watanabe was a consultant, it notes that because of the prevalence of alcohol, social inhibitions peel back. During the Hanshin quake, support line Women's Net Kobe noted that, for instance, for several months after the earthquake, Kobe streets had no electricity. In dark streets with so many collapsed buildings, many women were raped. And something similar happened in the wake of the Tohoku triple disaster, where Rob Gilhooly knows. In the months following the disaster, incidents of violence against women have reportedly increased. Professor Meiko Yoshihama has a similar conclusion, noting right in the beginning of her investigation on violence after 3/11, that incidents of violence against women and children following major disasters have been documented worldwide, yet remain virtually unrecognized and untold in Japan. And it seems to sometimes boil down to an image concern. After 3/11, the National Police Agency issued a warning against the alleged quote-unquote rumors that rapes and other serious crimes had been committed in the disaster-affected areas. So, why is this all important? What's all the sexual assault stuff, Joe? Okay, this happens like twice in Japan, so why is this important? The show is more than willing to depict this side of a disaster because this is very much a reality of those stuck within them. The previous Japan Sings texts don't really do this. 3/11 wasn't just disaster and everyone buckled up and came together, but it was also in some ways a war of images and public relations. It was a clash of narratives between very, very real senses of unity and bonding in the wake of an immediate catastrophe, but it was also trying to tackle and balance the real miseries that emerge. In the 1973 Moritani film, there's a brief cut, right, in the destruction of Tokyo, in which, strikingly, there's a lady with glass in her face, right? And, that sucks. She got glass in her face. But we never see her again. And yet, in a real disaster, that lady with the glass in her face never goes away. Yuasa mentions that one of the challenges associated with showing disasters is that there are a lot of incredibly grimy and brutal elements that you can't really shy away from, especially if it's from a frame of reference like 311, which is, the event that he was talking about in the context of Japan Sinks 2020. And when you focus more closely on the everyday tribulations of people stuck, keyword stuck, in these disasters, as say critic and writer Toshiaki Endo has done, you have to wonder exactly what sort of representations and messages will arise from the ground up, and what we would have missed otherwise had we forgotten about this perspective. And it's funny, because one of the biggest missing messages can all be focused on in Shan City. Shan City collapses everything I've talked about until now into a neat package. Though it's not the last arc, it is in the context of Japan Sinks 2020 as drawing upon a 311 sensibility, arguably the most important arc. In the Japan Sinks 2020 novelization, of which I spent 710 yen on and completely regret, because it's literally just like the TV show, but like in text form. It's like the Sam Raimi Spider... In the book, in the novel, Shan City is described between an ancient civilization and a Shinko Shukyo, a new religion. So going back to Toshiaki Endo, he believes that Shan City is interesting in the sense that it's reminiscent of a new age precarity, similar to, in his approximation, something you'd see in, say, Dennis Hopper's 1969 film Easy Rider.
Why don't they reveal themselves to us is because if they did, it would cause a general panic. Now, I mean, we still have leaders. These leaders have decided to repress this information because of the tremendous shock that it would cause to our antiquated systems.
But Shan City is also important for a few other reasons. Now, let's be clear here. The Japan Sinks franchise never actually shied away from new religions. In the novels, Tadokoro, Onodera's kind of boss, is largely ostracized by the scientific community. However, it's important to note that his research finds an angel investor in the form of a Shinshukyo, the Church of the Seven Seas. And this is an international Shinshukyo. And so Shan City makes a lot of sense as a place for, regular people like the Mutos to find Onodera because, his ties to Tadokoro and how both of them are related to cults. And it's not even just a Japan Sinks kind of thing. You can obviously see the cult intertwining with apocalyptic imagination as pretty common. It's just a generic millenarian trope. You can look at Katsuhiro Otomo's manga adaptation of Akira, where there's a lot more focus on Lady Miyoko's character, and it's also kind of funny because in Akira you also have a mute political religious figurehead, which seems to obviously be a reference to the Emperor of Japan. In Mochizuki Minataro's Dragonhead, a manga that imagines the annihilation of Tokyo and subsequently Japan, we also run into cults. And in 51 Ways to Protect Her, the protagonist gets suckered into going to a cult compound. In fact, Watanabe makes a really interesting point in that manga. After a disaster, religious groups, especially the Shinshukyo, come out of the woodwork. And while many are harmless and well-meaning, many can be quite insidious. A lot of this boils down to a breakdown of public relations even before the Ohm attacks. Levi McLaughlin noted that during the Hanshin quake, there was a sort of apocryphal saying. People were noting how the situation on the ground in Kobe was so dire that residents are forced to accept help from cults and gangsters. There was, in effect, a massive public relations problem, and we can see how that's reflected here. The compound is separate, ominous, strange, but there's no conversion, not really. And in the novels, remember the choice of words. It was a Shinko Sukyo, which is reminiscent of the phraseology of the groups during the 1995 Hanshin quake, when their public relations were at their lowest point. And it's somewhat appropriate considering that Shan City is functionally run by Yakuza. Given that the penultimate dangerous cult, Om Shinrikyo, was described by scholar Nobutaka Inoue as merely a criminal group cloaked in religious garb. The Shan City, for the most part, doesn't seem to be violent. I mean, it sells weed, right? But that's hardly the most terrible thing to do, and while it doesn't seem to have a great safety record, we can chalk it up to its largely broad acceptance of people, including refugees.
I'm not implying anything.
If you factor in the invisible collapse I mentioned earlier, it clicks together, right? So then what's going on here? Like, what's up? What's going on? McLaughlin notes that in the wake of 3/11, some of the first and by far the largest groups to send recovery teams were religious organizations, and most notably, the largest single religious relief operation wasn't a Shinto group, wasn't a mainstream Buddhist group, wasn't a Christian group. It was a Shinshukyo. It was Soka Gakkai. Within 20 minutes after the earthquake, Soka Gakkai's cultural center in Sendai, for instance, became a hub for refugees, and proselytization was suspended. According to McLaughlin, the Soka Gakkai administration enjoined disaster response volunteers to make no attempts to engage refugees through the standard Gakkai practice of shakubuku, the conversion technique favored by Soka Gakkai in Japan. And Soka Gakkai wasn't the only one. Numerous religious groups mobilized fast, much faster than many relief and government groups in the wake of 3/11, and more notably established much firmer and longer-lasting recovery stations. In fact, many years after the disaster has passed, religious organizations are often at the helm of long-term engagement with community reconstruction. That again, according to McLaughlin, the Japanese public has begun looking beyond the traumas of 3/11, and new reports about the many thousands of Tohoku residents who still live with the pains and deprivations of the disaster are growing increasingly less frequent. Religious organizations are some of the few groups that maintained active aid efforts long after international aid agencies and government emergency crews left the area. And now they're working to raise awareness about their activities and to solicit volunteers in the face of dwindling national concern. To summarize it, long after government agencies and other emergency aid providers have left the scene, religious practitioners remain to care for the dead and the bereaved. Thus, Shan City might come off as strange and sometimes goofy, but there's something unavoidable here. These groups have always been there, and regardless of their intentions, they will remain there even after supposedly a disaster has occurred. And thus the imagination of disaster is indelibly linked to an imagination that cannot separate reconstruction, care, or recovery without these actors. And it's no surprise, therefore, that members of Shan City go down with it. The city becomes the nexus of a new sense of belonging, sort of like a new furusato, a new home that, like in 3/11, even after everyone has forgotten these people, these religious movements have not.
この世に必要ない命などない。一緒に作ろうよ。
ここはそういうところだし、今はそういう時だよ。
It's no surprise that Daniel, a Yugoslavian, someone without a home country, chooses to stay behind.
ここが僕がいる場所なんだ。
And once again, we come back to representation, a global representation of Japan. Religious activity during the 3/11 crisis, while it was reported to be much more positive, was still relatively underreported. And thus the Shan City arc shines a light on that critical dimension. It's no surprise that it's in the heart of a Shinshukyo compound that Ayumu and Mari really bond in the wake of this catastrophe, that this quiet time occurs here, in a religious compound. This is a reference to Kokoro no Kia, a sort of therapy for the soul, something that was really pushed by religious groups during 3/11. Okay, So how does this link back to the global image sentiment? Well, remember Komatsu. 311 was an international disaster. We come back to this depiction of things that in emphasizing the smaller, closer, more ordinary, we can see with a lot more clarity. The political machinations of previous Japan sinks do, in some senses, touch upon religious organizations, just as how they touched upon some of the core and periphery, just as how they touched upon visible versus invisible collapses. But by magnifying these elements, Japan Sinks 2020 also illuminates greater and more complex networks of affect. I think the point is somewhat belabored, right? And I'm being repetitive, but it's very important. Everything I've read about Japan Sinks 2020 is largely seeming to depict an ordinary perspective with a contemporary, globally aware Japanese citizen. But there's a caveat, because that comes with some very, at some points, uncomfortable narratives that have to be dealt with. Otherwise, we risk of facing very real tribulations that transpire. So every year at Kiyomizudera, there's a kanji of the year, and it's to capture the sentiments of what represents that year. The first year it happened was in 1995, and the kanji of the year was quake. In 2001, because of 9/11, it was war. In 2011, it was bonds. It was supposed to capture this sentiment that everyone came together and overcame 3/11. But there is a comment by Professor and Pastor Tomoshi Okuda that I thought was interesting, which he says, Kizuna wa kizu o fukumu, or that bonds contain wounds. This isn't the first time it comes up. I mean, hell, look at Mario Okada's Kizunaiver.
あなた方は何よりも強い。傷の絆で結ばれた。
I think it's pretty self-explanatory. Unification is predicated on pain. We come together in the face of adversity. But I want to stress that Japan Sinks 2020 acknowledges this sense of bonding, this overcoming the odds. But at the same time, the odds, that overcoming, is so dependent on not ignoring the painfulness associated with that bonding. We can easily forget that this disaster happened. I mentioned this before multiple times, and so I'm going to sound like a broken record, right? But Komatsu Sakyo began writing the original Japan Sinks in 1964, when the Tokyo Olympics revealed a new, uncertain order for post-war Japan. The sentiment is, of course, is to ask, what does Japaneseness actually mean if it's so different, and that difference is in full display. It's no surprise that in both Moritani and Hikiji's films, that they have shots reminiscent of the Tokyo Olympics. And Japan Sinks 2020, like clockwork, carries the same Olympics. But when Ayumi is competing, there's something interesting. She reveals her prosthesis. This is a permanent disfiguration, a wound that doesn't heal, and will never heal. In showing the ugliness of disaster, Japan Sinks 2020 also shows that such a bonding isn't something to overcome, but something that indelibly shapes you as a survivor. It's no surprise, therefore, that Ayumu's wound, her kizu, becomes something more, a marker, a permanent marker of her subjectivity. Japan Sinks 2020 is very much about overcoming the odds, but at the same time, we can't forget that these odds existed in the first place. What we do with them, how we handle them, and how we remember them, I think, are questions that are somewhat left unanswered. In an almost bittersweet ending, Japan is starting to rise again. But what follows that revival is not going to be a new Japan with new places and verdant fields, but in effect the almost spectral bones of the old one. The ruins are going to rise up again. In Komatsu's Japan Sinks 2, the islands are gone forever, and it's up to Japan to play a mediating role to guide the world in the wake of a new coming catastrophe. But for Japan Sinks 2020, the land will return. But what exactly returns are the memories of the calamity. And like clockwork, we're back at it again. We're back at the Olympics and the Tokyo Olympics. The 2020 Olympics obviously ran into complications with COVID, but it is fitting that the show ends with the Olympics, especially since that Japan Sinks, the franchise itself, began with the Olympics. Japan's contemporary televisual culture began with that event, that 1964 event. And what was on display was a completely new Japan, a seemingly strong and cohesive post-war Japan.
Their happy nation, Japan, who has worked so hard, so very, very hard, to get ready for this, the opening day.
There is thus some irony here that Japan Sinks 2020 is broadcast on Netflix, not for the Japanese to see, but for the whole world to see. And what does it show? It doesn't show a strong, cohesive post-war Japan, but a spectral entity flitting between disaster, uncertainty, and in kind of equal measures, hopefulness, but also a sort of cynical hopelessness. Of course, I don't know exactly where Japan Sinks is going to go from here. It always kind of has new imaginations, new conditions, new situation. And it's not like every single one is going to be like amazing, but there are, I think, every time going to be interesting because it always has in its DNA reflected a sort of sentimentality of what exactly where Japan is going to be or how it should be thought by its creators and the people interpreting it. So it is interesting to think about the ways in which authors might think and rethink, shape and reshape a lot of the conditions that Japan Sinks might reflect or be reflected. God damn it. We're alone. You can tell me. I swayed you on evolution. First off, huge thanks to every single patron. They're the ones who look at my channel and go, yeah, I'll give this maniac my money. Their names are scrolling along the side as I speak. Major shoutouts to Rebecca for agreeing to come on. Please check out her work. She's got this really good monthly zine. It's got comics, it's got short stories, it's got articles, and as far as I can tell, it's completely free. It's just PDF just right on the site. Link is in the video description. It's really awesome. Before I get to patron questions, I want to give a shout out to a few friends of mine. Their Study of Sword, Sam Ham, and This Week I Review. Study of Swords did a really interesting video on swordplay in Kimetsu no Yaiba. So if you're the kind of person who's like, wow, I wish Joe would talk about more recent stuff, of which I realized the irony in that comment on a Japan Sinks 2020 video. Well, there you go. So please check it out. If you do, tell him I sent you so he knows that I didn't just say I'd shout him out and didn't. In regards to the others, Sam Han recently made a video on Azuma's Database, and Alec made a video on film and manga film adaptations of manga. I don't have much of a follow-up other than that. I'm really bad. You can tell that I'm really bad at selling things. Okay, let's get to patron questions. So, Fairlight asks, how do you feel Japan Sinks 2020 considers the role of the archive? The last episode in particular feels like a celebration of the power of the archive, the evidence of lived culture and Japan's multimedia heritage. And this stands in stark contrast to Shan City's silent, expressionless Jomon statues. Also, a big chunk of the plot revolved around the effort to recover the research archive at great expense. But I might be reaching a bit on that one. Yeah, that's really interesting. So Jacques Derrida, talks a lot about archive and sort of the self-violence that occurs with archival process. And I think Fairlight is making a really interesting connection in that sense. The idea that preservation is also an exercise of power. I'm not entirely sure myself on exactly how or precisely what the archive in Japan Sinks 2020 is necessarily telling us, but I do think that he's right, or that he's on the right track, and that violence is an inherent facet of archiving. Not only is it literally something being preserved in the wake of immense violence, but it's also fascinating with respect to what is archived. When we see what's revealed at the end, a lot of what we know is what the international community knows of Japan. The Japan that's preserved, right, is like an internationalist Japan. And it's not necessarily images of Kojiki or harrowing images of Burakumin or multi-ethnicity or anything like that. But they're all images of cool Japan. It's that cool Japan delivery. It's cosplay, bozuzoku, anime, and that's what's preserved, right? Which is really interesting. I think the Jomon statues is also a really good observation. I don't know much about the Jomon myself. Like, okay, so like I know who they are, but I can't really say much about them. With regards to another respect, Kinsuki, right? I find it really fascinating when we go back to this idea of like archiving, because Kinsuki is a sort of aesthetic that's defined arguably by earthquakes, you know, by fractures, but exactly where this goes, I'm not entirely sure. Lord Liquid Bacon II asks, who's your favorite VTuber? I tend to spend a lot more time with smaller ones than the big Nijisanji or Whole Life folks. Not that there's anything like wrong with them, right? But I like spending more time with smaller content creators. Probably overall, I'd say is Hina, who's a farmer VTuber from Fukushima that does a lot of like tomato recipes. I sometimes listen to Sumishiro Mashiro, which I sometimes use to fall asleep to, because she's got like a really relaxing voice. The biggest VTuber I've supported is probably Pikame. I've been following her since she was at like 20k subs, right? So seeing her blow up is really awesome, because she's been on the grind for a while. If you look at some of her old streams, you might find me at random moments in the chat. Crime Lord Tony Montana asks, do you know the Gaming Sheriff project on Twitch? I do not, but I think that might be you, so I respect the hustle. If it's not, then I don't. I took a quick look and I couldn't find anything, so keep me posted if there's any more details on that. Gil asks, favorite version of the Onodera character? Each version seems to represent a different kind of Japanese man. In 1973, it's Shinjin-ri. In 2006, it's Hikikomori, you know, entering the workforce. In 2020, which might be a reference to the aged Japanese person who has no agency. So, which version do you think is the most interesting? Yeah, Onodera is always been a character that's bridged the audience with the premise. He's always the person who's supposed to be like the hero who steps up and tries to save the day, even if he might fail. I think he's kind of a boring character overall, though, since, as you note, he's essentially an audience insert for the most part. He's an examination of like a shifting identity and how that new identity handles it. With that in mind, I quite like Japan Sinks 2020's Onodera because he's silent, right? He's in effect someone with ties, sure, but he just can't muscle his way through the story. He needs others. So yeah, that's my vote. The Philosopher's Meme asks, I heard that The Wind Rises and The Tale of Princess Kaguya were supposed to be released as a double feature, just as My Neighbor Totoro and Grave of the Fireflies had been. The thematic link between the latter two films is obvious, but I can't figure out what exactly links the former two. So what do you think it is? I don't know. Ghibli's not really a big thing for me. Okay, so I know based off the comments by the late Nobuhiko Obayashi that Kaguya was partly developed, if I recall, as a way to deal with the loss during 3/11, and it was broadcast in a lot of disaster-ridden areas. So in that sense, I think both of them might be linked by an idea of identity formed out of loss, but how and to what extent, I'm not entirely sure. This, I think, is somebody who knows more about. So this is really a question more so for somebody who would know more about Ghibli than I do. You know, I tend to talk about like, you know, real like epic win shit, like the Gashikashi is about candy. Joe cut to black.